Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek. Chapter 11. Last time, we learned the third declension, a consonantal declension that has a series of case endings for masculine, feminine, and neuter that have some similarities to the first and second declension, but also some unique forms. This chart reviews those forms for you. Please pay particular attention to the genitive singular, omicron sigma, the nominative plural, epsilon sigma, and the accusative plural, alpha sigma. Last time we also learned several declension patterns and noticed what happens when the sigma of the nominative singular or the dative plural collides with certain consonants called stops. In the example of sarx here, one sees that the stem, sark plus sigma, ends up with a xi at the end in both the nominative singular and dative plural. This chart reviews two other patterns with which we became familiar, the mot patterns, which are words that are all neuter, the tau of the stem dropping off in the nominative singular and accusative singular, and the new stem examples. Here the interrogative pronoun, and we also learned the indefinite pronoun, which just has a different accent from the forms you see here of tis and ti. And in our last lesson, we learned about 3-1-3 adjectives, which use the third declension for the masculine and neuter, and the first declension for the feminine. In that case, the word actually has two different stems, one consonantal, one that ends in a vowel, and inflects as you see here. Pas, the word for every or all, is one of the most frequently used adjectives of this 3-1-3 pattern. In today's lesson, we'll look at first and second person pronouns. We'll first review a few facts about such pronouns in English, then look at their forms and characteristics in Greek. We're not learning any new usages of cases, so it's primarily a task of being able to parse the form and recognize case, number, and person. Our other activity in this lesson will be to expose ourselves to more third declension patterns. The third declension can be quite confusing if one tries to memorize all the respective patterns. But if one can see the basic pattern behind these variants, then one can at least recognize the forms. And that's the goal, to be able to parse the forms and then translate them. First of all, pronouns in English. Pronouns stand in the place of a noun. The personal pronoun replaces a personal noun. For example, I replaces Mark. There are three persons to pronouns in English. There's the first person, the person speaking, I or we. The second person, the person spoken to, you. And the third person, the person spoken about, he, she, it, or they. In this lesson, we'll focus on the first and second person pronouns only. We'll take up the third person pronoun in a later lesson. In English, personal pronouns inflect. They have a case, either subjective, possessive, or objective, and that case helps determine their function. He is subjective in the example, and so it functions as a subject. His is possessive, and her is objective. Notice how the third person pronouns, he, she, it, inflect, and that helps us to recognize how they function. Personal pronouns also have number. In English, at least in the first person, we distinguish between the first person singular, I am Bethany, and the first person plural. It's incorrect to say, we are Bethany. However, in English, in the second person, you, there is no distinguishing between singular and plural, at least not in normal American English, and that can be a form of confusion, especially in some of the precise statements that are made in the New Testament. Personal pronouns don't have a gender. I will work for Bob. I will work for Sally. But they do have person. So when we parse a personal pronoun, we ask case, number, and person, not gender. And what's true of English is also true in Greek. So since the pronouns function in similar ways, the key challenge in learning the first and second person pronoun are their forms. We look at them now. The first person singular pronouns are ego, the nominative singular, mu, the genitive singular, moi, the dative singular, and me, the accusative singular. While one can see some similarities to previous inflections, the upsilon in the genitive singular, the iota in the dative singular, many students find it's just easier to memorize these personal pronouns. The second person singular pronouns are su, su, soy, and se. And again, there are some similarities to previous declensions, but recognition through memorization is probably advisable. You probably noticed that the genitive, dative, and accusative singulars of the first and second person pronouns are without accent. They're enclitic. But there are alternative forms of these three that have accents, and in the case of the first person pronoun, have a leading epsilon. These alternate forms show up in two contexts. First of all, if a first or second person singular pronoun follows a preposition and is the object of it, it will almost always be in this alternate form. The second usage of these accented or alternate forms is for emphasis, to stress the first or second person pronoun in the sentence. Your textbook calls these forms emphatic forms, but I think that's deceptive. They're just an alternate form, but they show up in two circumstances, with prepositions and then sometimes for emphasis, when there is no preposition involved. The first person plural pronouns are hemes, hemon, hemin, and hemas. Again, you'll see minor similarities to what we've looked at before, but enough difference to call for memorization. The second person plural pronouns are similar. In fact, only the initial letter is different. Hemes, hemon, hemin, and hemas. And these are the you plural forms. In my classes, I'll always ask you to distinguish the you in your translation as to whether it's singular or plural. That's important theologically. It's also important because English doesn't do so naturally. Students often have trouble distinguishing hemes from hemes, we from you plural, because the forms are so similar. But if one puns on the initial upsilon, it's himes that has a U in it. And with that mnemonic device, one can hopefully keep these forms apart. Having been introduced to the first and second person pronouns, let's look at a couple of sentences, well-known ones from the Bible. Ego eimi, the words that God spoke when God revealed God's language, at least as they're translated in the Septuagint, I am. Jesus also used that phrase for analogies in the fourth gospel. I am the good shepherd. The second example, himes de tina me legate enai, is the question that Jesus asked of his followers at Caesarea Philippi. But you, whom do you say that I am? Now you'll notice I translated the me, the accusative form, as I. That's because in English we do indirect discourse in with our regular case usage. In Greek, it's done with the accusative and infinitive, but we don't speak that way in English. We don't say, whom do you say me to be? We say, whom do you say that I am? The third example is Peter's response. Si ha Christos ha huios tu theu tu zontos. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. We've noted some characteristics of these first and second person pronouns. Let's pull those characteristics together. The forms of the first and second person pronouns, their inflections, are somewhat similar to declensions we've seen earlier, but there are enough differences, especially in the plurals, that it makes sense to memorize them. There all are alternate forms. Those forms are used with prepositions, or they're used for emphasis when they're not used with prepositions. In terms of parsing, remember, it's case, person, and number with the first and second person pronouns, because these pronouns can be used for a masculine, feminine, or neuter antecedent. In translation, and this is a point your textbook does not make, if the nominative of the first or second pronoun is added to a sentence, that usually adds emphasis, because the pronoun is already present in the verb. We'll learn more about pronouns in the verb later in the course. That's the new material in this lesson, the forms of the first and second person pronoun. We now turn back to third declension nouns to show you several more patterns by which these nouns inflect. They're actually using the same set of case endings. It's just the stem ends differently, and that causes some minor glitches along the way. So let's look at these patterns. Charit is the stem of charis, the word for grace. Here I've listed the stem plus the standard third declension masculine feminine endings that you should know by now. The sigma of the nominative singular, when it combines with a dental, such as tau, causes the dental to drop off, and so our initial form is charis. Genitive singular, charitos, that's easy to see. Dative singular, chariti, that's easy to see. Accusative singular, charita, is also easy to see. However, there's an alternate form for the accusative singular of this particular noun, charin. And of the accusative singulars of charis in the New Testament, 42 of 44 use this alternate form, charin. The plurals are quite straightforward. Charites for the nominative plural, chariton for the genitive plural, charisi for the dative plural, and charitas for the accusative plural. The neuter noun phos works the same way. Its stem, thot, ends in a dental. So when the sigma of the nominative gets added, the tau drops out. But you'll say, wait a minute, this is a neuter noun. This apparently is an example of where a neuter was attracted to the pattern of other dentals and used a sigma when normally neuters don't in the nominative singular. So our forms are phos, photos, photi, phos again, nominative and accusative being identical, phota, photon, phosi, and phota. Elpid, the word for hope, is a third example of a dental in the third declension. When the sigma is added, the delta drops out. The other forms follow in expected course. Elpis, elpidos, elpidi, elpida, elpides, elpidon, elpisi, and elpidas. Another pattern that shows up in the third declension involves stems that end in a consonantal iota. You recall the third declension is a declension in which the stems end in a consonant. Here we have iota or epsilon, as you see in the chart highlighted in blue. There were apparently two iotas in Greek, one which was a vowel and one which was a consonant. The consonantal iota alternates with an epsilon, but behind that epsilon, according to grammarians, is the consonantal iota. And since these are consonantal, they don't behave quite like vowels. For example, in the genitive singular, to make up for the epsilon preceding it, the omicron of the ending os lengthens to omega. This is an ablouting. In the nominative plural, the epsilon of the stem, and remember that's a consonantal iota, epsilon, combines with the epsilon of the nominative plural ending, epsilon sigma, two epsilons merging to make the diphthong epsilon iota. So actually in this case, the consonantal iota behind the epsilon is acting more like a vowel than a consonant. Also please note that the accusative plural of this form is identical to the nominative plural of this form. This is what we would expect with neuter nouns, not this noun, but it happens with this noun. Pistis, in other words, is rather awkward noun, but it occurs quite often as the word for faith in the New Testament, and so we must be able to parse it. Its fully inflected forms are in the right-hand column, and I have highlighted the consonantal iota, or the epsilon replacement of it, throughout. Pistis, nominative singular, pisteos, genitive singular, piste, dative singular, pistin, accusative singular. Notice how similar that is to charin. I think that's where charin came from. In the nominative plural, pistes, genitive plural, pisteon, dative plural, pistesi, accusative plural, pistes. Telling the difference between the nominative and accusative plural is done by context. A number of third declension nouns follow the pattern that we see with the familiar word pater for father. Here, something quite unusual is happening. The stem, which ends in a row, changes depending on the case ending added to it by either lengthening or dropping the vowel of the second syllable. That vowel of the second syllable is epsilon. One can see it in the accusative singular, the nominative plural, the genitive plural, and the accusative plural. That can either lengthen to eta, as in the nominative singular, or it can drop out, as in the genitive singular, the dative singular, and the dative plural. Hedor is a neuter noun, the stem of which is hedot, but in the nominative and accusative singular, it behaves somewhat like the nominative singular of pater. So it's hedor is the nominative singular, hedatos is the genitive singular, hedati, dative singular, and then hedor for the accusative singular because it's neuter, and then the other forms follow according to patterns with which we're familiar. As we are now getting to the end of the lesson, let's practice some parsing of forms that we've already seen. Caritas. Notice the omicron sigma at the end of the word. So it would be genitive, singular, and from charis, which is feminine. The second form, pistes, might be a bit confusing until you recall that the epsilon, which ends the stem, actually stands in for consonantal iota. And the epsilon sigma ending, when added to an epsilon, yields epsilon iota sigma. So this would be nominative plural or accusative plural feminine. The third form is photi. There, the iota stands out, dative singular, and you've memorized or will memorize the form as neuter. Hemas is the accusative plural of the first person pronoun. It has the alpha sigma ending of the third declension. In the second column, elpidez is quite easy to recognize. Epsilon sigma, that would be the nominative plural, and the form, the root form is feminine. Hedasi also by now should be easy to recognize, the sigma iota being dative plural. The challenge would be to recognize that this form comes from the word hedor, a neuter word for water. Charin is the accusative singular alternative form for the feminine noun charis. This particular form of the accusative singular occurs far more often than charita. And the last form is soy, the second person singular pronoun, the iota at the end indicating its dative. So hopefully this review of some of these more troubling endings will help them cement for you. In this lesson, we've looked at first and second person pronouns. They function almost identically in Greek and English. So our focus has been on the forms of those pronouns, along with the forms of several other third declension patterns. As seemingly disparate as those patterns are, if one looks for the case ending, one can parse the forms, and then you're on your way to a translation.